You're also working very close to policy making and delivering data and delivering information to policymakers to impact social change. And the economist, the lead economist, the executive director of that institute is a good example for economists who don't stay in their dark and dusty small office buried among books. Dr. Jamshid Amoui, his entire curriculum vitae is basically a testimony to what economics can be. He has far-reaching experience as a high-level, very high-level bureaucrat in Iran. He has worked for the United Nations as an economist in the field in a variety of African countries. And most importantly of all, he has a social conscience. He always talks about how economics and decisions that are concerning the economy have impact, have unintended consequences on some of the most vulnerable populations in this country, but also at a global scale. So I wanted to thank Dr. Amoui for keeping up the good work with the Center of Economics of Social Issues and bringing such an important and maybe even complex topic to us with a fascinating speaker. So I hope you'll enjoy our speaker. I hope you'll enjoy the engagement with the speaker. And I would like to introduce Dr. Amoui. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerhard. It's a pleasure to be working with the colleagues like you, working in the environment of California Lutheran University. I'm going to introduce our distinguished speaker today, but you inspired me to say a few words about the economics of social issues. And yes, I have had a long journey since I called myself an economist, maybe a good, I have to think about it, but maybe 45, 46 years since I started it. And so over time I found that economics can be meaningful to me, and I'm sure to many of you, when you have a human face on it. And then I learned more as I developed further that it is really the face of life. It's not just the human, but it is plants and animals. And pretty much this is the guiding criteria that I have for myself, and I think the Center for Economics of Social Issues are pretty much focused on that. I strongly believe, and you will see tonight when our distinguished speaker speaks about the issue, that economic changes are not random issues. They do not happen out of blue. They don't happen because, well, it just happened. No, there are reasons. There are fundamental reasons. And when we want to solve a problem, we are obliged to look into the roots of the problems. And this is pretty much the spirit of the discussion, conversation, presentation, whatever you want to call it tonight here. And I'm so delighted to see that you're here. So let me now introduce our distinguished speaker. We're delighted to have Mr. Álvaro de Regil Castilla. He is the project initiator and the executive director of the Semper Global Alliance. You will forgive me, Álvaro, if I make any mistake in pronouncing things in the wrong way. This was established in 2003. The Global Alliance brought a coalition together and supports living wages worldwide. Within the Alliance, living wage is the core element of sustainability, democracy, and business accountability. As developer of the Living Wage North and South Initiative, the abbreviation is TLWNSI. In 1999, Mr. Castilla has been its coordinator since 2001. Álvaro's work is centered on developing a living wage concept anchored on equal pay for equal work of equal value, principle which is accepted by many nations and international organizations. Let us not forget that in the United States, President John F. Kennedy in 1963 signed the Equal Pay Act, which was aimed really to make the wages of women and men equal for the same work in the same place. And it's rather sad that after 56 years, we're still battling with how we really put that law in action in his letter and his spirit. But we have moved definitely and improved a lot. So Mr. Castilla has taken this principle into a broader level, advancing people and planet paradigm. As a part of this transformative concept, he is also increasingly active in the areas of labor rights, business and human rights, no growth, degrowth, or steady state economics, basic income and consumer rights. He is a founding member and a facilitator of International Living Wage Observatory at La Salle University in his Mexico campus, a contributor to the transformative vision and the praxis of Global Transition Initiative of the Toulouse University in Boston Institute, Toulouse Institute in Boston, and he has been a consultant for causes of immigration with various community organizations in California. Let us welcome Mr. Castillas.
Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me clearly? Okay. Well, just give me a minute to set up this. I think it's on. Okay. I'm sorry, it's taken a couple of minutes because I have a Mac and it has to go through another process. Okay. So now, okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Thaler. Thanks so much, Dr. Damway. And thank you to California Lutheran University. And I am really honored about having all of you coming here to talk about the root causes of immigration. And I really mean this because I think that this is a unique opportunity to talk about an issue that is very rarely addressed by the media, government, and society. And this is because those who are in power and benefit from the current situation, from the current arrangement, are not interested in making people aware about the root causes of immigration. So at the question of why people come here, most make the very simplistic assumption that immigrants come here because we are rich and they are poor. But the truth is that the root causes of immigration are very complex, and we must become aware that we share a great degree of responsibility about these issues. The point that I want to make is that if we really want to solve the issue of immigration in this country, we must stop looking only at the consequences and start looking primarily at the underlying causes of immigration, because that is the only way that we can solve the immigration conundrum. So in this presentation, we're going to be spending 30 minutes focusing on Mexico, simply because Mexico has been the main source of immigrants to the United States for many decades, and to California and Ventura County, and even more so after NAFTA came into effect in 1994. So what are the underlying causes of immigration? Well, these are systemic and global economic structures that cause millions of people to lose any opportunity to enjoy a dignified quality of life in their own country. As a direct result of the tacit agreement between the elites of both countries, yes, both countries, not just the United States, but also the elite from Mexico, to impose and maintain the neoliberal economic structures that benefit them, the 1%, or I rather say the less than 1%, and decimate the livelihoods of the vast majority of the 99%. But what are the specific economic structures that trigger immigration? Well, these are two. The first one is wages that can only be construed in what I call a standard of modern slave work wages. And predatory trade agreements impacting specific economic sectors with consequences that plunder the standard of living of millions of people. Wages have indeed been decimated in Mexico for the last 36 years as a result of a consistent and deliberate economic policy to impose neoliberal structures worldwide. Structures that replace what I call put money in the workers' pockets, or demand-side economics, with put money in the employers' pockets, or supply-side economics. These are policies that specifically reduce and limit labor rights through structural reforms, reduce real wages to increase competitive advantages, privatize public assets and natural resources vital for life, and deregulate economic and financial structures to allow markets, the markets, to set the public agenda and allow them, the markets again, to regulate themselves through non-binding, self-designed guidelines and standards. So in these settles, wages are decimated to attract specifically as much foreign direct investment as possible by offering specifically labor costs at bondage prices. And predatory trade agreements such as NAFTA are created to develop a regional system for global corporations to create what is called the global commodity supply chains, with huge increases in productivity made possible by, once again, dramatically reducing labor costs in a good portion of the global manufacturing supply chains. Now, to duly address the root causes of immigration, we must do it in the context of a living wage ethos, which I assume that most of you already know that is a human right globally recognized, where, and this is extremely important, equal pay for equal work of equal value, like Dr. Damway mentioned, is the pillar sustaining it. So because of that, the International Labor Organization has established for decades that for a fair globalization, the decent work concept has led to an international consensus that productive employment and decent work are key elements to achieving poverty reduction. Accordingly, rather than driving people into the informal economy, such as in the case of Mexico, where 60% of workers work in the informal economy, or creating massive migrations, which is also the case of Mexico, global expansion must find ways to deliver opportunities for decent work where people live. So the living wage anchored on the pillar of equal pay for equal work of equal value has been enshrined for many decades as a human right in international law. It's nothing new. And so we have it in Article 23 of the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, concerning the right of workers to equal pay for equal work. And in Article 7 of the UN's International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights of 1966, for fair wages and equal remuneration for work of equal value. And of course, in ILO's Convention 100 of equal pay for work of equal value. Now, from a global perspective, we're going to look at the situation of wages in Mexico in manufacturing. And we're going to observe an ethos of rather asymmetric wage rates in North America. And we're going to do it in the context, once again, of equal pay for equal work of equal value. But in order to do this, we're going to do the following exercise. I'm going to ask you to do the following exercise, and that is to ask ourselves the following question. Why, if a worker working for Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan, putting 4 parts in the Ford assembly line of the Ford Focus, what if he makes $40 an hour? A worker working also for Ford Motor Company, but this time in Mexico, putting exactly the same 4 parts in exactly the same Ford assembly line of the Ford Focus, makes only $4 an hour, or about 10%. But the cost of living in Mexico is not 10%. It's a lot more. So we're going to look at this with real figures for all employees in manufacturing, using purchasing power parities to account for the differences in cost of living. So we have that in 2016, the nominal hourly wage rate in the United States in manufacturing was $39.03. But in Mexico was only $3.91, about 10%. However, the cost of living was not 10%, but 54%. So that means that that worker, for doing exactly the same job, should have been paid $21.15, accounting for the cost of living. But he was paid only $3.91. So in real terms, accounting for the cost of living, that amounts to about 18% of what he should have been paid in the first place. So I'm going to ask you to bear in mind for 1 second that 18%, because we're going to look at what has happened with wages in Mexico over time in manufacturing. And so that 18%, if we go to 1975, it was actually 37%, so more than twice. And then in 1980, it went to 42%, and in fact, in 1981, it achieved the highest rate at 44%. And then, as the direct result of a deliberate economic policy, it started going down to 33, 28, and by the time NAFTA became effective, it was already down at 19%. And as you can see, ever since that time, it has become a flat line, as the direct result of a deliberate economic policy to plunder wages in Mexico. Now, let's look at the effects of NAFTA 1.0 in the inbound plants sector of the global commodity chains in place in Mexico. So the main features are that before NAFTA, in 1976, that sector had 448 plants, employing 74,500 workers. But more than 20 years after NAFTA, in 2017, the sector reported 6,166 plants employing almost 2.9 million workers at, once again, modern slave work wages. And as a fact, the level of exploitation, labor and human rights violations, and workplace hazards and insecurity is the worst in the entire industrial sector, including the murder or disappearance of thousands of female maquiladora workers in Ciudad Juarez and many other cities across the US-Mexico border. And once again, the main reason for offshoring into Mexico is cheap labor costs that allow employers to maximize the return on investment and shareholder value. Now, so we have already looked at the situation of wages in Mexico from a global perspective. Now we're going to look at them from a domestic perspective. And in order to do that, we're going to compare what is called the indispensable basket of goods which is considered the minimum necessary to enjoy a dignified quality of life. It's a basket of goods and services. It's equal to a benchmark for the living wage against the monthly general minimum wage in Mexico. So in 2014, the cost of that basket in pesos was 16,445. But the minimum wage was that year only 2019. So it could only afford a fraction of the basket of goods, the minimum wage. Well, at the beginning of this year, the cost of that basket has gone up to about 22,000 pesos, and the minimum wage has gone up to 3,080 pesos. But it has barely improved in affordability, only 2 points to 14% of the indispensable basket of goods. Of course, as in any economy, many workers make much more than the minimum wage. In fact, many Mexicans make several minimum wages. So we're going to look at the distribution of wage earners in Mexico by the number of minimum wages in 2018. And according to the Mexican government, 74% of all employed persons earn not more than 5 minimum wages. But it takes more than 7 minimum wages to afford the basket. So we can say with a great degree of confidence in our estimate that not more than 15% earn enough to buy the indispensable basket of goods in 2018. In other words, not more than 15% of all wage earners in Mexico enjoy a living wage in 2018. Now, let's do exactly the same exercise of comparing the indispensable basket of goods against the best paid workers in the economy, which are the manufacturing workers. So we have that the estimated monthly cost of the indispensable basket of goods in 2016 in dollars was $991. But the monthly net income after taxes of manufacturing workers was $488. So it wasn't even half. It was actually 49% among the best paid workers in the economy. Now, let's look at the other sector of the economy that has been gravely impacted by NAFTA, and this is the agricultural sector. So what is the direct effect of NAFTA on the loss of millions of jobs in agriculture? NAFTA's rather pernicious effects destroy or reduce the quality of life of millions of people in the 3 countries, particularly in the agricultural sector due to agribusiness, but it was in Mexico where the greatest damage was inflicted. Let's look first at what happened in the US. Just between 1996 and 2001, farming subsidies nearly tripled to more than $20 billion given from the US government to agribusiness. However, net income of farmers dropped 16.5%, forcing about 300,000 farmers, mostly small farmers in the US, out of business. And as a consequence, many rural communities died as storefronts were boarded up, churches were closed down, people were forced from their homes by the toxic fumes of industrial animal factories, and an amphetamine epidemic swept the US. As for Mexico, NAFTA liberalized corn and many other products such as sugar and beans. And because of that $20 billion in subsidies to agribusiness, large agribusiness corporations such as Cargill and ADM flooded the market with subsidized products at prices below production cost in Mexico. As a consequence, by 2006, over 2 million agricultural jobs, including 1.7 million small farmers, were lost, and workers, farmers, and their families were forced to leave the countryside. And I am stressing families because when I say that 2 million jobs were lost, it really means that 8 million people lost their livelihoods, because the average number of members per household in Mexico is 4. So if 2 million jobs were lost, it really means that 8 million people lost their livelihoods. So Mexicans were forced to leave their towns with 3 choices. The first choice was to move to the slums of Mexico's big cities and seek work, mostly in the underground economy, and at modern slave work wages, which is the standard. The second choice was to come here, to migrate to the US despite the increasing perils of coming here without proper documentation. And the third choice was to join the ranks of people working for the drug cartels, is the choice of last recourse, or working for other types of organized crime. Now, let's look, going back to manufacturing, at the potential effect of the upcoming NAFTA 2.0 on Mexican wages. Well, there are two major provisions in NAFTA 2.0. There is one that is a positive one, and there is another one that is a negative one. So let's look at the positive one. There is a potentially positive new labor provision if enforced, and that's that Mexico's labor reform to incorporate ILO's Convention number 98 of 1949, which is the right to organize and collective bargaining, was finally ratified by the Mexican Congress last year. So because of this, I don't know if you're aware, but the ILO has over 100 conventions, but there are 8 fundamental conventions. And by Mexico ratifying this convention, it has already ratified all of the 8 fundamental conventions. But this is really ironic because the US has so far ratified only 2 conventions, only 2 of the 8 fundamental conventions. So what this really means is that far more important than ratifying conventions or other types of labor standards, what is really important is making sure that these standards, whether they are domestic, from domestic laws or international law, are enforced. That's what really makes a difference. Also, in line with this convention, NAFTA 2.0 text includes modest but meaningful labor standard gains. The key one is rules to end wage suppressing protection contracts in Mexico, which has been the standard forever. And what this means is that corrupt labor leaders in Mexico work really for the employers, both domestic and global corporations, to make sure that in the contracts they are allowed to pay Mexican workers a modern slave work wage. So if these new provisions are enforced, this could make a real difference over time to raise Mexican wages, which also would cut incentives to outsource jobs from the US to Mexico. But so far, NAFTA's 2.0 text lacks the monitoring or enforcement terms necessary for the rules to make a difference for workers. If this changes and the new rules are enforced, it would be very positive. The latest information I can share with you is that 2 weeks ago, a number of members of the US Congress went to Mexico to meet with the Mexican president, and the president committed to making sure that these new provisions are enforced, and he also committed to assigning a specific budget so that the government can have the necessary human and other types of resources and systems to enforce these new provisions. So this could be a very positive provision. Now, there is a potentially rather negative new labor provision if it materializes. And that is a new rules of origin provision for the motor vehicle industry, Article 7, where parties agreed on a labor value content of 40% for passenger vehicles and 45% for light and heavy trucks. What this means is that 40 to 45% of the value of cars and light and heavy trucks must be produced by workers paid at the very least $16 an hour to qualify as originating in North America in order to enjoy zero trade tariffs. Well, the first problem is that this is rather difficult to calculate its real effect because only other firms know precisely where each element of their product is made, and so far there is no process in place to assess this effect. But the much bigger problem is that this could be a double-edged sword. This could well be very positive by pressuring corporations to increase wages in Mexico so that these wages can go up to the $16 threshold. But it can also be a Trojan horse from the Trump administration against Mexico. So let me explain. In 2016, the hourly total compensation costs in the automotive industry were For Mexico, $4.68. For the US, $48.97. And for Canada, $34.19. So for the US and Canada, this is a non-issue because wages are much higher than the $16 threshold. But for Mexico, there is a huge gap. So it is a big problem. The gaps, in fact, on real purchasing power parity wages in manufacturing and specifically in the automotive industry are so enormous that we have done the projections and it would take at the very least 2 decades to fully close them from 468 to 2654, not even counting for inflation. So let's try to be positive and do the following. Let's look at the following potential scenario. The new Mexican government committed to recover real wages and has already increased the minimum wage in 2019 by an unprecedented 16.2%. And I say unprecedented because for 36 years, wages in Mexico were not increased at all in real terms. As I showed before, they were depleted. They were plundered. So even if we make a simplistic assumption and apply the actual increase for 2019 of 16.2 to motor industry wages, and we project to achieve a nominal wage of just $16 an hour, it would take roughly 8 years to reach the motor vehicle threshold if all assumption, that is, if inflation, cost of living, and exchange rates materialize. So as you can see in this chart, if we go from $4.70 to $16, it would take 8 years. However, knowing Trump, if he's still in power for another term, he could easily demand as soon as NAFTA 2.0 becomes effective that a chunk of motor vehicle production from Mexico be transferred to the US because the local value content of $16 was not met in Mexico. So if this happens, it would be extremely detrimental to Mexico and specifically to the Mexican workers because 80% of what Mexico exports to the US comes from manufacturing, and about 70% of all manufacturing exports from the US, from Mexico to the US, come from the motor vehicle industry. This is the most important sector in NAFTA. So it would be very detrimental if it happens. In conclusion, since NAFTA, it can clearly be asserted that the modern slave work ethos in place in Mexico subsidizes the US economy and US population in terms of capital extraction for the benefit of the shareholder value of institutional investors of international financial markets, both in manufacturing and agriculture. Wages and salaries of US workers and employees who are part of their global supply chain, and US consumers paying much lower prices. Now, let's look briefly at the consequences of Mexico's modern slave work ethos in immigration flows. Between 2000 and 2005, more than 400,000 Mexicans, mostly from rural communities, moved annually to the US. So by 2009, more than 12 million had moved to the US. However, undocumented immigration stabilized by 2014 at around 11 million as a result of the increased criminalization of immigration and the emergence of its incarceration industrial complex. As a result, the number of undocumented Mexican immigrants in the US has steadily decreased and stabilized at around 5 million. But the point I want to make is that today, as we speak, yet 200,000 Mexicans continue to cross the border from Mexico annually, with even more from Central America and many other countries. A situation that I can guarantee you that it will never stop as long as we do not address the root causes of immigration. Now, who benefits from these systemic structures? Well, first, the institutional investors of international financial markets and their corporations by maximizing their shareholder value. Also, politicians both in the US and Mexico, yes, in Mexico too, by getting financial support for their electoral campaigns in exchange for imposing the market-driven agenda designed by the business elites. Also, the savings in slave wages paid in Mexico helped a lot to subsidize the much higher wages paid to equivalent workers in the US of the same corporations. In fact, globally, it is estimated that 25 to 40% of the cost of labor in the North is subsidized by the South's meager wages. Lastly, US consumers also greatly benefit from bondage wages paid in Mexico by enjoying much lower prices than if the entire production would be made in the US. So we must become aware that we are also supporting with our consumer choices this system of global exploitation. In conclusion, the South subsidizes the North's economic growth, the North's good living in terms of shareholder value, workers' wages, and consumer prices. Now, how can we address the root causes of immigration? Well, the first thing is that we must become aware about the hurdles, and there are three major hurdles. The first one is that the same systemic structures that benefit from this arrangement oppose any type of binding regulatory framework via national or international law to force global corporations to pay living wages to all their workers. As for the voluntary concept of so-called corporate social responsibility, this is really a public relations hoax because companies have systematically refused to incorporate a living wage standard in their voluntary guidelines. And we should and we must, of course, write to our members of Congress, but it has a relatively little effect because the same systemic structures that benefit from this arrangement finance the political campaigns of many of them. Not all, but many of them. So we are left with two tools. The first one is increasing our pressure using our consumer power, which, by the way, if it's well organized, it is a very powerful tool. And two, increasing our pressure, we must increase our pressure with our members of Congress. Lastly, what can we do as responsible citizens in practical terms to effectively address the root causes of immigration? Well, the first thing and the easiest thing is to use individually our consumer power to make well-informed and socially and environmentally conscious decisions to support responsible companies and reject irresponsible ones. We should also join consumer organizations and ask them to include in their own agenda a project to push for a living wage standard in the guidelines used by corporations voluntarily. That way, corporate social responsibility will no longer be a public relations hoax. And we must increase our pressure with our members of Congress to ask them to push for binding legislation that would force corporations to pay living wages globally. Finally, as you can see in all of this, the key factor in addressing effectively the root causes of immigration is obviously the living wage. So if we are able to organize successfully to force corporations to start gradually closing that gap, paying to Mexican workers a living wage, I can guarantee you 100% that Mexicans will be more than happy to remain in their own country to enjoy a dignified quality of life by earning a living wage. Thank you so much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay. So we have a couple of mics that can go around. So if you just raise your hand, our friends will come and give you the mic so you can try and use.
Here's one. Here's one.
Anybody?
Here's one mic.
Thank you.
Short line. Okay. And then, so could you start, please? And back, and then you, and then Mike. I'll try to see the result here, but please, if you go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Oh. And then you with the next one.
You'll be next.
Please.
Hello, thank you very much. That's mind-blowing. Can you say something about what the impact is or how it intersects with the drug trade, the cartels, and everything in terms of people wanting to leave? Because I know a number of people who are here because they've been terrorized So,
Yes, the drug trade, in my opinion, is one of the consequences of this structural situation, which by destroying any opportunity to enjoy a dignified quality of life, people, like I said, they try to work, but most of them are not satisfied with living with modern slave work wages, and some of them opt for joining people that already work in drug cartels or in other forms of organized crime that are growing in Mexico. And it is true that this has become so bad that there are areas in Mexico that are completely controlled by drug cartels, and because of that, that triggers even more people, emigration from Mexico to the United States or to other countries.
My background is in working for the state legislature, and so I'm unimpressed by your use of pressure on the United States Congress, because they are not really beholden to their constituents. They're beholden to their funding sources, and their funding sources are antithetical to what you're suggesting. So I ask you, what alternatives do you have to working with the Congress, because I find that an impossible situation in the current state of American politics.
Well, first, in my opinion, I think you're right. I mean, that's why I said that there is a relative positive effect in putting pressure on our members of Congress, because many of them are financed by these structural forces that are, like you said, are antithetical to what I am suggesting. But I think that the first step, I believe that there is very low awareness about the true causes of consequences, the true causes of immigration from Mexico to the United States and from many countries to the United States. Like I said, most people, because very few talk about this, the media doesn't talk about this, government doesn't want to talk about this, so society at large doesn't talk about this, then very few people are really aware about the true reasons of why they come here. So the first step is to increase awareness, to make people aware, because the only way to put pressure on our government, on Congress, and other branches of, the executive branch, and in our electoral decisions is by making people aware. So, like I said, if we really want to solve the issue of immigration, we must know that they don't come here because they are poor and we are rich. They come here because there is a system that structurally destroys the livelihoods of many people, and they have no choice. And both in Mexico and in the US, the elites work all the time to try to maintain this low level, very low level of awareness. So for me, the first step is to make people aware about the root causes so that we can then react, get organized. And I believe that if there is enough awareness of people that have a social conscience, we would be able to change reality or the situation here by really putting a lot of pressure with our members of Congress. I know that some of them are sensitive, but most of them are not. And but we can change that if we become aware, if we increase awareness.
NAFTA goes back to the 90s?
1994.
1994, but there's been illegal immigration before that. Was there wage disparity before that too, or are there other factors that contribute?
Yes, there was wage disparity. And like I said in the chart that I show you, way before NAFTA, there was a big wage disparity. But it was much less worse than today. Like I show you, if we use the equal pay for equal work of equal value, the best rate of Mexican wages was at 44%, and now it's not even half, it's 18%. So because of that, and because of NAFTA, and because of the $20 billion in subsidies to agribusiness, millions of jobs have been destroyed in Mexico. And because of that, that's why they came here. And that's why if you see the figures, I had a chart that shows how the flows of the immigration came here. It really surges after NAFTA. That's a direct consequence of NAFTA. Before, it was like a steady low flow, and then increased a lot. And then it started going down because of the criminalization of immigration.
One of the challenges with, I think, your analysis of the living wage is that you're kind of forced to kind of look back to be able to, develop the time series data and then create your hypothesis. But moving forward, we're looking at a completely different global manufacturing environment in less than 10 years because AI and robotics, their livable wage is zero. They just need electricity at 10 cents a kilowatt hour and some maintenance. And it doesn't matter whether manufacturing is in China or the US or Mexico, 40%, upwards of 40% of clerical manufacturing jobs could be impacted or displaced. So I think it's important in doing this kind of policy analysis to really look forward and say what is really going to happen when we reach that tipping point. I don't know if you saw Google announce their breakthrough in quantum computing.
Yeah, I just saw it.
And what are the implications of that, that kind of computing power at such an incredibly small size and format. So I think you have to look forward and ask the question, how do we address that next wave?
Well, I am aware of that. It is, you're right. I agree with you completely. And it is extremely difficult. And what I do when I do that kind of analysis, I'm presenting this just to make you aware of, about why they came here. And as long as they keep exploiting them, I think that we must continue to react and push for a change with the current structures. But I know that it's going to change very fast. But when I look at that, I really make a quantum leap because I believe that capitalism worldwide is it's an oxymoron with democracy. And regardless, let's forget about democracy and philosophy and all frameworks of ethical values. Capitalism is completely unsustainable beyond that because of the basic laws of physics. Because there cannot be a system, or a system cannot aspire to be sustainable that demands the infinite consumption of resources in a planet that has finite resources. So what I'm saying is that I know that this is getting worse, but unless we do something, we're going to reach a point in which this thing is going to really explode. And by, what I say by explode is, I don't mean a revolution or a human explosion. I'm going to say the planet is going to react to such a point that at least the way that we can imagine that humanity is going to live will no longer be possible.
Over here. Hi.
Hi.
My question is, how much do you think that Mexican government is not so much at fault, but what can they do or bring to the table where they can bargain with such a powerful government like the U.S., where it's not a lose-lose situation to whatever they get at the end of the trade deal?
Well, first I have to say that beginning in 1982, all the Mexican governments have worked with the global powers to put in place the structures demanded by the market that maximize shareholder value and return on investment. So they are as responsible as the U.S. government or all those in power in the world. They are as responsible for what has happened to Mexican workers. And Mexican workers is just an example. This is really a global issue. The only thing that has changed is that there is a new government that started less than a year ago and is trying to change things. But in my opinion, going back to what you're saying, is going to be extremely marginal. I mean, they increased the minimum wage for the first time in 36 years above inflation. Inflation was less than 5% and it increased it by 16%. Before, for 36 years, the minimum wage was increased below inflation, okay? But the impact is going to be very small. So the only thing that the government can do is to have, to put in place policies that will ameliorate the situation, but not really change the structures. Because, like you said, it's not just the U.S., it's a global, I mean, in my opinion, above the U.S. government is the metropolises of the system, which are the real, it's Wall Street, is the financial, institutional financial markets. They are the ones that call the shots. They are the ones that tell a corporation, well, for next quarter, I need $2.70 in dividends, and if you have to lay off 20,000 people, that's what you need to do, period. Or we're going to start with robotics, and we're going to eliminate 20,000 people, and I don't care. They are the ones that call the shots because they are the ones that finance the political campaigns of politicians in power, not just in the U.S., but everywhere.
Hi, thanks so much. So you mentioned mostly the auto industry here, and then you also mentioned that organizing is the best way forward. So if we can organize with our sort of like consumer power, that would be a nice way to push against these sort of global systems. So is there anyone doing that work in terms of organizing people to work with their consumer power, and is it beyond the auto industry?
No, it's beyond the auto industry, and there are many organizations around the world that are trying to do that. I can name, for instance, OECD Watch in Amsterdam that has over 150 NGOs all over the world. That basically what they do is the OECD is the Organization for Economic Development. And is basically the club of wealthy nations plus a few emerging markets, including Mexico and Chile and a few others. And there is a book that is called The Guidelines for Multinational Corporations and Other Business Enterprises, and they have a number of standards. But I have witnessed that, I have experienced that personally. We have tried several times to, when the guidelines are revised, to enter the living wage standard, and the International Chamber of Commerce, which is the club for all national chambers of commerce, has consistently worked to block that. But regardless of that, there have been some successful stories in some countries, in some emerging markets, as well as in some developed markets, such as in England, where they have, for instance, created co-op chains of grocery stores, where they work with fair trade organizations, and they try to, again, ameliorate the situation, but it's very hard to change the structures. However, I think that we must, the first thing that we must do is increase awareness so that we can put pressure on our politicians, because now they think that, well, they don't know, so we don't care, most of them.
Hi, right here.
Yes.
Good afternoon. What is your response to people that claim that the lowering of the wages is just a sign of the free market economy mindset, and that instead of outsourcing like manufacturing into China, it's now being outsourced into Mexico for a higher quality at a lower price?
Well, what I say, and I've heard that many times, the market, if the market is the one that commands, that sets the rules, the market logic that you just mentioned, then we're not really living in a democracy, in a real democracy, because the only purpose of a true democratic ethos is to pursue the welfare of people and planet. and not the market. Okay? The market is the opposite. The market has an individualistic mindset. The only purpose of the market of corporations is the maximization of shareholder value, the maximization of return of investment, regardless of who gets negatively impacted by that. And the purpose of democracy is the opposite. The purpose of democracy is to procure the welfare of every rank of society, and especially of the dispossessed, to have justice and equality. So what I say to those people, I heard that many times before, is that, well, if you think that way, then I mean, you do not agree with justice and true democracy. You agree with marketocracy, because if we follow that logic, then we're not living in democracy. We're living in marketocracy, or the dictatorship of the market. Sure.
Ask a question and also make a comment. There was a question that you said that the future is one of automation. The future may be different with now, correct? And agree that you accept that principle also. But here is the case. And I want you to react to that if you agree or disagree, and also that you asked the question. Here is the core of the issue. Whatever is the proceed of the production and activity, it gets divided at the end between, let's say, workers, those who work, and return on capital, and other things you can count it, as a part of facilitating the workplace and other things that goes to the owner of the capital. So right now, for example, we have a divide of 70-30, about that, not in everywhere, but in total. And from what I was listening to you, Álvaro, came that that's not really the ratio that we have in Mexico. So if you really take those wages, and particularly bring Ford Company, others into it, the divide is maybe 90-10, 90-15, whatever. So when one talks about future, that doesn't change. That doesn't change. That's a structural divide, that it is. So in fact, if you are going more towards the labor, less from the capital, or the other way around, you get to that impossibility. So in other words, if you really take more of automation, other things, so how do you contribute that? Contribute to productivity of worker or return on capital? That's a big debate. I don't think it really changes the picture. There is one change there, and that change is that you really have a situation that the workers there may actually get more because of that. Depends on how the situation from now till then evolve. And here is the case, maybe you bring it more home, which you actually even alluded to that, even with that fast increase, in the minimum wage of $16, you said there is a danger to the next 5 years, 6 years, that we're not really escalating the wage to that extent. It doesn't change the picture, really. It just, again, you have the same battle, the battle of how you divide the proceed between the two blocks, so to speak, labor and return on capital. So I want you to comment on that, and if you like to come and comment on that, you're most welcome.
Yeah. Well, there is an economic indicator that, to me, it is very important, because what he's talking about is the share of income by capital and labor in all countries, okay? And you can see that after neoliberalism, that share of income has gone down everywhere, including the United States. And in emerging markets like Mexico, it has gone down even much faster. So the problem is the mindset of capitalism in its worst phase, which is neoliberalism, which is, I can give you an example using the logic of the market where everyone would win. If you start increasing the wages of workers here and workers in Mexico and workers in India, China, everywhere, from the logic of the market, then you're aggregating demand and you're increasing the purchasing power of these people. Therefore, the market would grow, demand would grow, and that would increase the size of the business of each company. It would increase it in the size. If you increase wages, it would decrease in the share of income between capital and labor, okay? Because you're giving a greater percent to workers. Well, the workers are putting that greater percent in return in consumption to business. So business would benefit also in terms of a bigger, it's a bigger pie with a smaller size, but if you count the dollars, it would be a bigger amount of dollars for each company. But that's not how, especially global corporations work, because that takes years. You have to think midterm and long term, and their mindset is completely short term. So they think in terms of quarterly results. So they say, okay, for the next quarter, these are the results that we want. So they don't care about increasing the purchasing power of consumers, increasing aggregate demand. All they care is maximizing at the fastest possible rate their return on investment.
Just a comment about some structural issues between Mexico and the U.S., and that is that, while you showed this amazing multiple in terms of the wage rate in the United States for similar work, but you didn't adjust for taxes, and the U.S. heavily taxes labor, and if you look at it, recent tax reform, we've really, with this territorial corporate tax code, I mean, you've got these incredibly fast-growing companies that pay zero. I think Amazon, throughout its history, one of the most valuable companies on the planet, has paid almost zero income tax, corporate income tax over that period of rapid growth. So, yes. Meanwhile, the workers that work at Amazon, the tax rates in the United States are very, very high. And yes. as AI moves and robotics and AI advances, they don't pay Social Security tax, payroll taxes. We probably don't tax electricity, which they need at a sufficiently high level. So the tax structures of both Mexico and the U.S. need to probably change dramatically, and we need to reduce the tax burden on labor to kind of boost the purchasing power of workers in both countries. Yes. But they need to increase the tax burden on robotics and AI that's going to cause the loss of 40% of these jobs worldwide. And there's no indication in any of these countries, whether it be the U.S. or China or Mexico, that they're moving in that direction. So the politicians are very short-term oriented. They're kind of looking at 2 years, 4 years down the road. But yes. there's a wave coming, and these tax structures need to change dramatically, I think, to level the playing field and kind of get where you want to get, even without all of the work, which is good on the livable wage. You need to change the tax structure to kind of address the fact that we don't tax, in effect, these services that are substituting for more sophisticated labor as we move towards 2030. Eventually we get very high-level white-collar jobs that are completely displaced, that are paying 40% state and federal taxes, and they're being replaced by machine learning algorithms that pay zero. Right. So it's really there's a fundamental problem there that affects labor in both countries.
I totally agree with you. The problem that I see is the same problem that I've been talking about, changing living wages. Because to change the tax structure, we still need to go to our members of Congress and push them. So that's the first hurdle. The other thing is that the figures that I use here for hourly wages, I've been doing this for 20 years, and the source until 2015 was the U.S. Department of Labor. They would get that information from all the governments, and then they give it to researchers, and that information shows you for every country what part goes directly to the pocket of the worker and what part goes to Social Security and taxes.
Okay.
And in the case of Mexico, it's about 30% that goes to Social Security and taxes. That's why I think I show an example for the affordability of manufacturing workers of that basket after taxes.
Okay.
But yes, in the case of the US is higher. However, the hurdle that we need to bend is the corruption that exists in the system, because members of Congress really, many of them really work for the system and not for the people as they should.
Any other question?
Hi, Alvaro. So you mentioned that we as consumers have this consumer power, and if we do change our taste to prioritize buying from more social responsible companies, then there's a potential for basically those companies to not exist anymore, and eventually there's a big potential for that to lead to unemployment. Because if the margins are really tight in Mexico, then in theory, you know, making America great again, especially in the manufacturing industry, America or the U.S. could start, you know, producing more, but that would eventually leave Mexico with more unemployment, which is worse than not having a living wage. So wouldn't Mexico be hurt even more in that sense?
Well, when I talk about consumer power, it should be aimed at the decision makers of global corporations. Okay, so the pressure that you're going to put on global corporations is to change things to benefit all of their workers. That's why there is this so-called thing of corporate social responsibility that tries to, in paper, to demand from corporations to pay a living wage standard, not just to their workers in their home office, but to all their workers, including in their supply chains, even if those workers do not work directly for that company, because that company may decide to subcontract, like Apple, for instance, subcontracts in China for the production of the iPhone. Okay, but with corporate social responsibility and the pressure, especially the pressure from consumers, that could change. In my experience, what I have seen, especially in Europe, is that when consumers get organized, they have gone and they have stopped specifically buying from large grocery store chains. And as soon as that starts, that's when the companies start changing their practices, because that really hurts their bottom line immediately. So that is one way to put pressure. But I have to say that we're still at a very early stage, because, again, awareness is still very low. So the first step is to increase awareness about this.
Question? Please.
No, I was just saying, instead of talking about awareness, but we also need to create awareness in a way that's digestible and accessible for the people that we're trying to serve. Because I work for the public mental health care system, and a lot of people here are probably college educated. So what is kind of the responsibility to give that information in a way that is understandable?
Yeah, I am aware of that. I have to be very honest, I haven't done anything about that, but it needs to be done. And I think I lack the creativity to put together like a package of information at that level that people would understand. Well, I'm completely sure that is possible. And it's very easy, but for people that have that creativity. But it is very important. Yeah, we need to make people aware at all levels, not just at college educated levels. Yes?
You compared you compared wages, U.S. wages versus Mexican wages. do you have the figures for Chinese workers compared to U.S. workers and comparing Mexican labor wages versus Chinese labor
Yes.
on a global perspective?
Yes. You know, when I started doing this in 2003, the Bureau of Labor Statistics from the U.S. Department of Labor issued annually hourly compensation costs for about 28 countries. And then it started going up to about 34 countries. And then in 2015, Obama cut the budget. So they have to stop that research. But it was the economists at the U.S. Department of Labor moved to the Conference Board, which is a think tank in New York and D.C. And they have continued doing that. And now it has increased to 41 countries. And in the last 5 or 6 years, we have received information for India and China on an hourly rate. And I can tell you that when I started looking at the Chinese rates, they were much lower than the Mexican rates. They were like 70 cents an hour. But now they're almost at par with Mexico, around $4 an hour. So yes, we can do that type of comparison. And we have it for 28 European economies, China, India. In the Americas, we have Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Canada, the U.S., obviously, which is the benchmark because purchasing power parities are based on what the U.S. dollar can buy. And we have also Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia, as I can recall. So a total of 41 economies. Yes.
Any other question? Well, let me just, we have a little present for you, Álvaro. So, we'll get to this. All right. I really want to thank you so much. I'll speak loud because thank you so much for coming here and for your excellent presentation.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Really appreciate that.
I really appreciate it.
All of you for coming here and participating in this debate. This is the first one of the new series of Distinguished Speaker Series. You will hear from us. There will be more discussion. We'll try to pick up the topics that are really relevant on our time. And there's also this issue of, again, I want to repeat something that I said earlier on, economic changes are not random. They have reasons, and we have to really ponder, look into the reasons, dig deep, and find a lot, and go from there. And thank you again, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.